The clock above the ward entrance read 11:52 when Nurse Clara Whitmore finished her final rounds of the evening. She moved down the row of beds with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent 23 years learning how to exist without making a sound, how to check a pulse without disturbing a dream, how to adjust a drip line without a single metallic clink, how to breathe in a room full of sleeping people and take up no space at all. The hospital wing at St. Augustine's occupied the entire east corridor of the third floor, stretching between the stairwell and the narrow balcony that overlooked the courtyard garden. In the summer, the nurses sometimes stepped out there on their breaks to watch the roses. In February, nobody went near it. The cold came through the old glass frames and settled into the corridor like something alive, something that had claimed the space for itself. 12 beds. Tonight, 9 were occupied. Bed 1, Mr. Harold Fenn, 74, post-hip replacement, sleeping soundly beneath a blue blanket his daughter had brought from home. The blanket had a pattern of small anchors on it. Harold had never been on a boat in his life, but his daughter had bought it because it was the only one in the shop that didn't feel scratchy, and Harold had accepted this explanation without question. Bed 3, Pauline Ashcroft, 41, appendectomy recovery, who had spent most of the evening watching something on her phone with the volume turned so low, Clara could only hear it as a faint murmur, the ghost of a television laugh track. Bed 5, Thomas Yuen, 16, broken wrist from a skateboarding accident, restless and wakeful, and clearly miserable about being in hospital rather than with his friends on whatever night they were all spending together without him. He'd asked Clara twice if she could get him Wi-Fi. She'd said she'd look into it. She hadn't looked into it. The others were adult patients, 2 recovering from minor surgeries, 1 with a chest infection, 2 elderly women whose names Clara always mixed up despite her best efforts, Mrs. Holloway and Mrs. Hollingsworth, which really wasn't her fault, and a man in bed, 11, who had been admitted that afternoon with a severe migraine and who had been sleeping, apparently dreamlessly, ever since. Clara completed her rounds, updated the chart at the nurse's station, poured herself a small cup of cold coffee from the machine that she wouldn't bother drinking, and sat down at her desk to read the handover notes from the evening shift. 11-50-8. Hospital wing at midnight was its own particular world, separate from the one that existed during the day. The day belonged to the patients, to their visiting families, to the consultants with their clipboards, to the healthcare assistants with their trolleys and their cheerful efficiency. The night belonged to something else. Not silence exactly, because there was always sound. The hum of the ventilation system, the soft beep of monitors, the occasional murmur or cough from a sleeping patient, but a quality of stillness that felt different, felt older. Clara had always liked the night shift. She would never have admitted this to anyone, because it sounded like the sort of thing a person said when they were, as her sister put it, a bit too comfortable with being alone. But there was something she had never been able to articulate properly about the way the ward changed after midnight, the way the responsibilities simplified, the way the world outside stopped mattering, the way it was just her and the sleeping people in her care, and the long dark hours stretching out ahead. She was reading about Harold Fenn's pain management protocol when the sound came. It was soft, almost nothing. A shuffle, perhaps, or a caught breath. But it was different from the usual sounds of the ward, and Clara had spent 23 years learning the difference. She looked up. Thomas Yuen was sitting up in bed. This was not unusual. Thomas had been sitting up at various points throughout the evening, unable to sleep, fidgeting with the edge of his blanket or staring at the ceiling with the particular intensity of a 16-year-old who has been told that he absolutely must not do anything interesting for the next several days. What was unusual was that Thomas was not looking at his phone. He was not looking at the ceiling. He was looking at the bed opposite his, bed 6, which had been empty all evening, with an expression that Clara could not immediately categorize. It was not fear, exactly. It was something more careful than that. She rose from her desk without making a sound and walked toward him. "Thomas," she said quietly, "you should be sleeping." He didn't startle, which was interesting. Most people, called to from across a dark room, would at least flinch. Thomas just turned to look at her with that same careful expression. "There's someone in bed 6, he said. Clara looked at bed 6. The curtain was half drawn, the way she always left the empty beds at night, not fully closed, so she could see at a glance that they were unoccupied, but pulled partway across to create a sense of privacy for the occupied beds nearby. The bed was empty. "No, there isn't," Clara said. "There was." Thomas paused. "About 10 minutes ago. I was awake, I couldn't sleep, and I saw someone sit down on it. I thought maybe it was a new patient, someone who'd been admitted late. But they didn't turn the light on, and nobody came to do any of the check-in stuff. They just sat there." "On the edge of the bed?" "Yeah, just sitting, looking toward the window." Clara looked toward the window at the end of the ward. Through the glass, she could see the courtyard below, the garden dark and featureless in February, the paths marked only by the dull glow of a few solar lights that had almost certainly run out of charge by now. "And then," she said, "and then you called my name, and I looked away for a second, and when I looked back, they were gone." He paused. "I know how that sounds." "How do you think it sounds?" "Like I'm either making it up, or I was half asleep and dreamed it." "Were you half asleep?" Thomas considered this with more seriousness than she might have expected from a 16-year-old at midnight. "I don't think so," he said finally. "I know the difference. I've been wide awake all night. My wrist hurts, and I can't get comfortable, and I keep thinking about." He stopped. "About what?" "It doesn't matter." He looked back at bed 6. "Who was in this ward before? I mean, before tonight, before I was here." Clara looked at him. "I'm not asking because I think it's haunted," he said quickly. "I know that sounds like that's what I'm asking, but I'm not. I don't know." Thinking out loud, Clara had been a nurse for 23 years. She had worked every shift pattern, every ward configuration, every staffing crisis and seasonal flu outbreak, and one memorably chaotic Christmas Eve involving a misdelivered catering order and a burst pipe. She had, in that time, heard a great many things she could not explain. Not because she believed in ghosts. She did not consider herself superstitious, but because hospitals were places where people were pushed to the edges of themselves, where fear and pain and medication and exhaustion did strange things to the brain as interpretation of the world. She had also, twice in 23 years, seen things herself that she had never mentioned to anyone. "I'll check the records," she said, "and I'll check the bed to make sure everything's as it should be. You should try to sleep." "I know," Thomas said. "I will." He paused. "Nurse Whitmore?" "Yes." "Were you going to tell me to go back to sleep whether or not you believed me?" She smiled at him, just slightly. "Good night, Thomas." Midnight passed. Clara did not check the ward records. She checked the bed instead, ran her hand over the mattress, straightened the pillow, looked beneath it and beneath the bed itself, and found nothing. She checked the window locks. She walked the full length of the ward and back. She looked out into the corridor. Nothing. At 12:20, the door to the ward opened, and Donald Ferris, her colleague for the night, came in with 2 cups of tea from the nurse's kitchen downstairs. He was a solidly built man of 48, with a quiet manner and a tendency to hum to himself very softly while he worked, which Clara had initially found irritating and now found deeply reassuring. "Quiet night?" he said, settling into the chair beside the nurse's station. "Mostly," Clara said. She picked up her tea. "Thomas Yuen in bed 5 says he saw someone sitting on bed 6 earlier." Donald looked at bed 6. "Empty bed?" "Yes." He considered this with no visible disturbance. "Could have been a dream. He says he was awake. People always say that." "He's a sharp kid." She hesitated. I checked the bed. Nothing. But he wasn't alarmed exactly. Just very certain about it. Donald shrugged. Not dismissively, but in the way of someone filing information away without immediate commentary. Happens sometimes. People pick up on things in a hospital, I think. Something about being vulnerable makes people more receptive. Receptive to what? Don't know. Each other, maybe. The building. History. He sipped his tea. I had a patient once, years back, in the cardiac ward. Woman in her 80s, completely lucid. No medication that would account for it. She told me she'd been visited every night for a week by a man in a brown coat who sat in the chair by her bed and told her it was going to be all right. Did you see him? No, but her daughter, who sat with her during the day, said her mother seemed calmer after those nights. Slept better, ate better, recovered better than anyone expected. He paused. I'm not saying it means anything. I'm saying it happened. Clara looked at bed 6 again. I'll do an extra check at 1, she said. Part 4. 1 in the morning, she did the check at 1 and again at 1:30, walking the full length of the ward in the particular. Quiet that deepened after midnight. The quality of silence that was not absence, but presence, a fullness rather than an emptiness. Mrs. Holloway in bed 8 was murmuring in her sleep. Clara paused to listen, but it was the inarticulate murmuring of deep dreaming, not distress, and she moved on. The man in bed 11 with the migraine had shifted in his sleep and kicked his blanket half off. Clara restored it without waking him. Pauline Ashcroft in bed 3 was awake, lying on her back with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling. She wasn't doing anything in particular. She wasn't looking at her phone. She was simply awake and thinking, can't sleep? Clara said softly. Pauline shook her head. It's fine. I do this at home too sometimes. Pain? Not much. Just, she trailed off. You know when you've had a thing done, and afterwards, there's this feeling that something's different? Not bad different, just rearranged. I know what you mean. I keep thinking about what my body must look like inside now. Different from how it was yesterday. Something removed that was there before. She paused. That sounds morbid, doesn't it? Sounds human, Clara said. Pauline was quiet for a moment. Then, the nurse who was here last week, not you. I mean the one during my pre-op appointment. She said they keep parts. Sorry? Things they remove. She said they keep them for a little while, for analysis, and then I don't know. She didn't say what happens next. And I've been lying here thinking about it. Thinking that for a little while, part of me is somewhere else in this building. In a little container or something. And I'm here, and it's there, and eventually she stopped. I'm sorry. This is very strange midnight conversation. It's fine, Clara said. You can say whatever you're thinking. Eventually we'll be separated. For good. Pauline looked at the ceiling. And that's fine, obviously. It was a diseased appendix. It was trying to kill me. But somehow it still feels like a loss. A little. Clara thought about this. She thought about it with the part of her mind that was not monitoring the ward, not tracking the sound of Donald's footsteps in the corridor, not calibrated to the frequency of the monitors. I think that's a very reasonable thing to feel, she said, even about something that had to go. Thomas Yuen was asleep. Clara checked it too and found him exactly as she'd hoped. On his side, wrist elevated on the pillow as instructed, breathing slow and regular. His face in sleep looked younger than 16. He looked like a child. She stood there for a moment, longer than was strictly necessary, and then moved on. The ward at 2 in the morning had reached its deepest point of stillness. Even the ventilation seemed to have quieted. Clara stood at the nurse's station and did nothing for a full minute, just listening to the building. 23 years of this, and the building still surprised her sometimes, the way it had moods, the way the same space felt entirely different, at different hours, on different nights, in different seasons. She thought about what Donald had said. Receptive. She had always been uncomfortable with that word in this context, because it implied there was something to be received. She was not superstitious. She did not believe in ghosts. She had spent 2 decades in evidence-based medicine and held that there was always a rational explanation for unusual observations, even when the rational explanation was simply, "I don't have enough information." But she had, twice in 23 years, seen things she could not explain. The first time had been early in her career, in a different hospital, in a ward for older patients. She'd been working a night shift like this one, and around 3 in the morning, she had walked into a side room to check on a patient, an elderly man who had been dying for several days, and found the room full of light. Not ordinary light, not the overhead fluorescent, which she had not turned on. A warm, sourceless light that was simply there filling the room with an impossible gentleness, and in which the dying man was sitting up in bed, looking at something she could not see with an expression she had never been able to name. Not joy exactly, but something close to it. Something in that neighborhood. The light lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then it was gone, and the man was lying flat again, and she stood in the doorway, with her heart hammering and her notes clutched to her chest. The man died the following morning, peacefully, his daughter holding his hand. Clara had told no one. Not her colleagues, not her then husband, not her sister. Some things felt too private to share, too much like they had been meant only for one person in one moment. The second time was harder to describe. She had been in this ward, actually, St. Augustine's, East Corridor, the same 12 beds, about 6 years ago. A woman had been recovering from major surgery and had not been recovering well. At some point in the small hours, Clara had sat beside her because the woman was frightened and asked her not to leave, and they had talked. Or rather, the woman had talked, and Clara had listened, and somewhere in the middle of that long conversation, Clara had the clear and unshakable sense of being watched. Not threatening, not uncomfortable, just watched from somewhere she couldn't identify, with something that felt very much like attention, interest, care. When the shift ended and she handed over, the woman was sleeping. She made a full recovery. Clara stood at the nurse's station and thought about all of this, and then she stopped thinking about it and went to do her 2:30 check. 3 o'clock, the deepest hour. In the cultures of nurses and other night workers, 3 in the morning has a particular reputation. The hour when the body is most confused, when the gap between waking and sleeping is thinnest, when the brain, overtaxed by its own darkness, begins to generate its own small hallucinations. A face in a corner, a figure in a doorway, a sound from an empty room. Clara knew all the physiology of it, knew about circadian rhythms and cortisol troughs, and the particular way exhaustion affects the processing of visual information. She had explained all of it to junior nurses and nursing students and worried family members who had sat through long nights and seen things that frightened them. She still checked bed 6 when she passed it at 3:15. It was empty. Obviously, Thomas UN slept on. Harold Fenn slept on, beneath his anchor blanket. Pauline Ashcroft had finally fallen asleep, her phone dark on the bedside table. Mrs. Holloway and Mrs. Hollingsworth slept in their respective beds. The man with the migraine hadn't moved. Clara walked to the window at the end of the ward and looked out at the courtyard below. The solar garden lights had indeed died. The garden was dark. In the center of it, barely visible, was the rose bed, bare in February, just dark earth and the thorned architecture of the stems, waiting. In a few months it would be full again, red and yellow, mostly with a few whites. She always meant to learn the names of the varieties, and never quite did. She stood at the window for a long time. She thought about the hospital as a structure, not the building itself, but what it was. A place where people arrived changed by pain and left changed again, altered by treatment and time and the specific experience of being cared for. A place of transitions. She thought about the many hundreds of people who had passed through this ward in 23 years of her tenure alone, and the many hundreds before that, in the decades and century before she arrived. What all those accumulated human experiences, fear, relief, suffering, recovery, love, loss, what they left behind, if anything. Nothing, she thought, or she tried to think it. It was not a thought that entirely held. She was still standing at the window when she heard it, not the shuffle she'd heard earlier. This was different. A sound she recognized, even though she hadn't heard it in a long time. It was a very quiet, very steady humming. A melody she couldn't identify, something old, something in a minor key, something that felt like it belonged to a different era. It was coming from somewhere down the ward. She turned. Bed 6 was not empty. The graveyard shift at St. Jude's was never my favorite, but it paid the bills. I was on the orthopedic floor, a place usually filled with post-op groans and the occasional late-night TV buzz. But tonight, it was eerily quiet. My heart started to beat a little faster. Policy is policy. You check everything. I pushed the door open gently. The room wasn't empty. She was incredibly thin, with skin like wrinkled parchment stretched over sharp bones. I cleared my throat. "Excuse me, ma'am?" She didn't turn around. She just sat there, her back ramrod straight, staring out the window at the city lights. "Ma'am?" Slowly, she turned her head. Her eyes were the most striking thing about her. "I'm just waiting," she said. Her voice was soft, but it had a strange, raspy quality, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Waiting for what?" I asked, trying to keep my tone professional, even though every instinct was screaming at me to back out of the room. "Oh no, dear," she chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "He's already here. He's always here." I frowned. When I turned back, she was still smiling that same unnerving smile. My patience was wearing thin. This was getting weird, and I still had a whole floor of actual patients to care for. She sighed, a long, weary sound. "My name doesn't matter anymore. Names are for the living." A chill went down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "What do you mean by that?" She finally turned her whole body to face me. "Tell me, dear, have you ever lost someone in this hospital?" The question caught me off guard. "Well, yes," I said quietly. "We're a hospital. It happens. And do you ever wonder where they go?" She pressed, her pale eyes fixed on mine. You should," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "because they don't always leave." My blood ran cold. I looked down at my chart, fumbling with the pen, trying to ground myself in reality. "Ma'am, you're clearly confused." I turned to leave, to get help, to get away from her. "Room 412, she said, her voice clear and strong now. I stopped in my tracks. "This was my room," she continued. "I died in this very bed, a year ago today." I slowly turned back to face her. My mind was racing. I remembered. I stared at her, at the woman who looked nothing, and yet everything like the memory of Mrs. Gable. "Mrs. Gable?" I whispered, the name catching in my throat. Her smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "I told you names are for the living." I followed her finger, my eyes scanning the dark corner where the walls met the ceiling. A tall, gaunt figure, darker than the darkness around it, was huddled in the corner. I couldn't breathe. The old woman's voice cut through my terror. "He comes for everyone, eventually, but he likes it here." The dark shape seemed to unfold itself slightly, stretching like a spider. "Why are you telling me this?" I managed to choke out. "Because you have kind eyes," she said simply, "and because he's hungry tonight. He's been watching you all shift." A strangled gasp escaped my lips. I took a step back, then another, my hand fumbling behind me for the doorknob. "Don't run, dear," the old woman said, her voice laced with a strange sort of pity. I didn't listen. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the closed door of room 412. I expected it to burst open. After a few minutes, I forced myself to move. I opened my mouth to tell her everything. About the woman, the shadow, the warning. So I just shook my head. I spent the rest of my shift jumping at every shadow, flinching at every unexpected noise. When the sun finally rose and my shift ended, I practically ran out of the hospital. I still work at St. Jude's. I need the job, but I never take the night shift anymore. And I remember the pale blue eyes of the woman in room 412, and I know that he's still there. Thanks for watching. Clara stood in the middle of the ward, a silent island in a sea of sleeping patients. Then she walked back to the nurse's station and sat down. Her tea, a kind gift from Donald hours ago, sat cold beside her, untouched. She wasn't scared, not really confused either. It was a familiar feeling, one that only comes at the very end of a long night shift. A kind of transparency, as if she'd been stripped down to a simpler, rawer version of herself. Her mind drifted to Margaret Doyle. She sifted through her memories, trying to place the name. Had she seen it in old records? Mentioned in the ward's history? Pictured in a faded photograph? Nothing came to mind. She'd have to look, she decided. In the morning, when the bright, ordinary light of day returned. Just after 5, Donald came through the door, carrying his coat and bag. He wore the comfortable, familiar exhaustion of someone who's made a career of working against the clock. "All quiet?" he asked. "All quiet," Clara replied. He gave her a searching look. "You don't work nights for this long without learning to read people." "You all right?" he asked. "Fine," she said. "Good night, actually." "Good," he said, sitting down. "Thomas Yuen is going to be very pleased to go home." "He is," Clara agreed, then paused. "Donald, did you ever hear of a nurse called Margaret Doyle? Worked in this ward before our time." Donald thought for a moment. "Doyle," he said slowly. "There's a Doyle on the board." He gestured to the wooden recognition panel on the far wall, a testament to long-serving staff. "Second row, I think. Margaret something." Clara's eyes found the board. She'd passed it thousands of times, a piece of the ward's furniture she'd never truly seen. In the dim morning light, the old-fashioned gold letters were just faint glints. "Long Service Award," Donald continued. 30 years? She'd be the name on there for night nursing. "I'd bet. There's always one." He looked at her. "Why?" "Just curious," Clara said, her voice soft. The first hint of February dawn began to soften the darkness outside. It wasn't much, just a graying of the black, a quiet promise of the day to come. Down in the garden, the bare rose stems would be catching that first light. In a few months, there would be flowers. Clara finished her handover notes, a careful log of the night's passage. Patient by patient, bed by bed. Harold Fenn, post-hip replacement, sleeping soundly. Pauline Ashcroft, post-appendectomy, who had been distressed but was now settled. Thomas Yuen, with his broken wrist, finally at peace. Everyone was stable, sleeping, on their way to being better. The morning shift arrived at 6, a wave of fresh energy. Clara handed over, answered their questions, then gathered her coat and bag. In the corridor, she paused and looked back. The day had already begun to clean the ward. Lights were brighter, voices were gentle but firm, and the first stirrings of a new day were underway. Harold Fenn was asking about breakfast. Thomas Yuen was awake, already reaching for his phone. The ward of the night was transforming, returning to the ordinary, just as it did every single morning. Clara walked down the corridor, but just before the stairwell, she stopped. She turned and faced the recognition board. Second row from the top, slightly right of center. Margaret Doyle, night nursing, 1954 to 1983. 30 years. Clara stood there for a long moment, just looking. Then she did what she always did at the end of every night. She took a breath and she let it go. She went home. She slept, and in a few months, the garden roses would bloom. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe for more.